I never thought I'd be starting over at 70. For 50 years, half a century, I believed I was living the American dream. Beautiful home in the Boston suburbs, 2 wonderful children, and what I thought was a faithful, loving husband. My name is Eleanor Mitchell, and this is the story of how I discovered my entire marriage was built on lies, and how I turned the greatest betrayal of my life into the most unexpected triumph. The morning of our golden wedding anniversary dawned bright and clear. I remember the sunlight streaming through our bedroom curtains as I woke up alone again. Richard was always an early riser, especially since his semi-retirement 5 years ago. He still consulted for his old firm 3 days a week, though lately those days had stretched longer with more emergency meetings and client dinners than ever before. I stretched my arms above my head, feeling the familiar ache in my joints but also a flutter of excitement. 50 years. We'd made it 50 years through raising children, career changes, health scares, and all the mundane struggles of building a life together. Today was our day to celebrate. Happy anniversary to us, I whispered to myself as I slipped on my robe and headed downstairs to start breakfast. I'd planned a special meal. Richard's favorite blueberry pancakes with the real maple syrup we brought back from our last trip to Vermont. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Richard's car wasn't in the driveway, which wasn't unusual these days. He'd probably gone to pick up flowers or was making last-minute arrangements for our celebration dinner tonight. At least that's what I told myself. I checked my phone and saw a text from him. Had to run to the office. We'll be back by 5 for dinner. Love you. On our anniversary. I sighed, but pushed down the disappointment. After 50 years, I'd learned to pick my battles. Besides, we had reservations at Maison Laurent, the French restaurant where we'd celebrated our 25th anniversary. Richard had promised to make this milestone special. I spent the day preparing. I had my hair done at the salon, splurged on a new dress, a sophisticated navy blue number that highlighted my still decent figure, and even treated myself to a professional makeup application. Our children, Michael and Sarah, had sent beautiful flower arrangements that now adorned our dining room. They couldn't attend our small anniversary party the following weekend due to their busy lives across the country, but they promised to video call during dinner. By 4:30 I was ready. By 5 Richard wasn't home. By 5:30, I'd called him twice with no answer. By 6 our reservation time, I was sitting alone in our living room, fully dressed with nowhere to go, fighting back tears of humiliation and anger. When the doorbell rang at 6:15, I practically ran to answer it, expecting Richard with some grand excuse and probably an armful of roses to make up for his lateness. Instead, I found a young woman I'd never seen before standing on my doorstep. She was perhaps 30, with auburn hair and a hesitant smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mrs. Mitchell?" she asked, her voice soft with a slight tremor. "Yes," I replied, confusion momentarily replacing my anger. "Can I help you?" She clutched her purse tighter. "My name is Valerie Winters. I need to speak with you about Richard. Your husband." Something in her tone made my stomach drop. "Is something wrong? Has there been an accident?" Panic surged through me. She shook her head quickly. No accident. But, may I come in? This isn't something we should discuss on your doorstep." I hesitated, but curiosity won out. I stepped aside to let her enter, noticing as she passed how her perfume was subtle but expensive. Her clothes were simple but well-tailored. Professional. Something about her seemed vaguely familiar, though I couldn't place what. We sat in my living room, the living room I decorated so carefully over decades, where Richard and I had opened Christmas presents with our children, where we'd hosted countless dinner parties and family gatherings. It suddenly felt like hostile territory. "Mrs. Mitchell," Valerie began, then stopped and took a deep breath. "This is difficult, and I've been debating for months whether to come to you. But when I found out today was your 50th wedding anniversary, I realized you deserved to know the truth." I sat perfectly still, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure she could hear it. "For the past 27 years, your husband has been living a double life," she continued, her voice stronger now. "He has another family, my mother, Nancy, and me. I'm his daughter." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I remember gripping the armrest of my chair, feeling like I might slide right off it and onto the floor. "That's impossible," I said automatically. "We've been married 50 years. Richard wouldn't. He met my mother when she was just 22, Valerie interrupted. She was his secretary at the Boston office. I was born a year later. I'm sorry, but it's true. He's maintained 2 households, 2 families, for almost 3 decades. This is absurd, I said, my voice rising. Why would you come here with such ridiculous lies? On our anniversary, no less. She reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope. I have proof. Birth certificates, photographs, financial records. He bought my mother a house in Brookline. He's been there 3 days a week, sometimes more, for my entire life. Brookline, the same neighborhood as his firm's Boston office, where he'd supposedly been consulting since his semi-retirement. With trembling hands, I took the envelope. Inside were exactly what she described: legal documents with Richard's signature, photos of him with this woman Nancy at what appeared to be Valerie's college graduation, family vacations, birthday celebrations. There was even a photo of them together that couldn't have been more than a month old, based on the clothes Richard was wearing. His arm was around her waist, his smile easy and intimate. Why? I finally managed to ask, the word barely a whisper. Why are you telling me this now? Valerie's expression softened with what looked like genuine compassion. My mother died 3 weeks ago. Cancer. At the end, she made me promise to tell you the truth. She said she couldn't rest knowing she'd helped steal half your life. I felt a bitter laugh bubble up. Half my life. Try all of it. 50 years today. I know, she said quietly. And I'm sorry. But there's more you need to know. Over the next hour, Valerie outlined the details of my husband's elaborate deception. How he'd told Nancy that he was trapped in a loveless marriage, but couldn't divorce me because of my fragile mental state. How he'd explained his absences to her with business trips and visiting his troubled wife. How he'd drained our joint accounts and retirement funds to finance his second life. Last month, after Mom's funeral, I found financial documents in her house, Valerie explained. Dad, Richard, has been systematically moving assets into accounts only he can access. He's planning to leave you, Mrs. Mitchell. Now that Mom is gone, he doesn't need the pretense anymore. The numbness that had enveloped me began to recede, replaced by a white-hot rage unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Does he know you're here? I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. She shook her head. No. He'd be furious. But you deserve to know before he blindsides you. Mom realized that too late. I stood up suddenly, startling Valerie. Thank you for coming. I need some time alone now. She nodded, gathering her purse. I left my contact information in the envelope. If you need anything or have questions later. I escorted her to the door, moving like an automaton. Just as she stepped outside, she turned back. Mrs. Mitchell? For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Mom was 2 at the end. She didn't know about you when it started. By the time she found out, she was already pregnant with me and felt trapped. I nodded stiffly, unable to speak, and closed the door. Then I did something I hadn't done since my mother died 15 years earlier. I collapsed on the floor and sobbed. Great heaving ugly cries that tore through my chest and left me gasping for air. I cried for the young bride I'd been, for the family I thought we'd built, for the trust I'd given so completely to a man who had never deserved it. I cried until my throat was raw and my eyes were swollen, until the beautiful makeup I'd had done for our celebration was streaked across my face. When there were no tears left, I picked myself up off the floor. I went to the bathroom, washed my face, and stared at my reflection, at the fine lines around my eyes, the silver strands in my hair, the slight softening of my jawline. All the marks of a life I thought had been well lived. 50 years, I whispered to my reflection. 50 years of lies. I changed out of my anniversary dress, hanging it carefully in the closet. Then I went to Richard's study, a room he'd always kept organized in his own way, which meant I rarely entered it out of respect for his space. Some respect he'd shown me. The room was immaculate, with built-in bookshelves housing leather-bound classics he'd never read and expensive trinkets from business trips that now felt like mockeries. His massive mahogany desk dominated the space, and I sat down in his chair, feeling strangely powerful in this forbidden territory. I started with the desk drawers, methodically working through each one. In the bottom right drawer, beneath a false bottom I discovered by chance, I found a small safe. Of course it was locked. I tried our anniversary date, today's date, with no success. Then I tried Valerie's birth date, which had been on the documents she showed me. Nothing. Finally, on a hunch, I tried Nancy's birthday, also listed on the documents. The safe clicked open. Inside was a treasure trove of Richard's deception, additional bank statements for accounts I'd never known about, property deeds, and a second passport that showed far more international travel than I'd ever been aware of. But most damning of all was a legal document, drafted by Richard's longtime friend and attorney, outlining a plan to divorce me on grounds of incompatibility, with a settlement that would leave me with barely enough to survive while shielding the bulk of our marital assets. The document was dated 3 months ago, when Nancy was still alive. The plan had been in motion even before her death. I felt strangely calm as I photographed every document with my phone, then carefully returned everything exactly as I'd found it. The rage was still there, but it had crystallized into something cold and hard and purposeful. Richard came home just after 9, breezing through the door with an enormous bouquet of roses and a blue Tiffany box. "Eleanor, darling, I'm so sorry," he called out as he entered. "The meeting ran late, and then I had trouble getting your gift and—" He stopped short when he saw me sitting quietly in the living room, still in my robe, no makeup, my hair undone. "What's wrong?" he asked, his expression shifting to concern so convincing it made me nauseated. "Are you feeling ill?" I really looked at him for the first time in years. The distinguished gray at his temples, the laugh lines around his eyes, the slight paunch he'd developed despite his rigorous tennis schedule. The face I'd woken up to for 5 decades. The face that had lied to me every single day. "Our reservation was for 6, I said quietly. "It's now past 9. Relief washed over his features. "Just a missed dinner reservation. Nothing serious." "I'm so sorry, Ellie. You know how these client meetings can go. But we can still celebrate. We'll go tomorrow instead. I'll call first thing in the morning and make sure they give us the best table." He approached, holding out the flowers and the little blue box. "Happy anniversary, my love." I didn't reach for either. "Where were you really, Richard?" His smile faltered slightly. "I told you a client meeting ran long, and then I wanted to get your gift just right." "Which client?" He blinked, obviously thrown by my persistence. "Thompson Healthcare. The new acquisition is causing regulatory issues." "Thompson Healthcare was acquired by a European conglomerate 8 months ago," I said flatly. "I read it in the business section." "Try again." A flash of something, annoyance? Worry? Crossed his face before his expression settled back into patient affection. "You must be thinking of Thompson Pharmaceuticals, darling. Easy to confuse. Now, aren't you going to open your gift?" I stood up, keeping the coffee table between us. "I had a visitor today. Valerie Winters. Your daughter." The change was instantaneous. The color drained from his face, and the flowers and gift box dropped from his suddenly limp hands. The roses scattered across our expensive Persian rug, petals breaking off on impact. "What did she want?" he asked, his voice tight with controlled panic. "To wish us a happy anniversary," I replied, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "What do you think she wanted, Richard?" "She came to tell me about her mother. About their house in Brookline. About the life you've been living while I sat here like a fool, believing in our marriage." He took a step toward me, hands outstretched in a placating gesture. "Eleanor, I can explain. 50 years. I shouted, surprising even myself with the force of my anger. 50 years of my life. And for nearly 30 of them you've been living a lie. Building another family. Stealing from our retirement to fund your little secret." "It wasn't like that," he protested weakly. "I never meant to hurt you." I laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Never meant to hurt me? You've been planning to divorce me and leave me destitute. I saw the papers in your safe." His expression hardened then, the mask of the devoted husband falling away completely. In its place was a stranger, calculating, cold. "You went through my things?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Your things?" I repeated incredulously. "In our house, bought with our money, much of which came from my inheritance, I might add." "Yes, Richard. I went through your things after finding out my entire marriage has been a sham." He ran a hand through his hair, visibly strategizing. "Look, this isn't how I wanted you to find out. It's complicated, Eleanor. Nancy was dying. I couldn't leave her then. But Nancy's been dead for 3 weeks now, hasn't she? And still you were here this morning pretending we were celebrating 50 years of fidelity and love. I felt sick. Were you ever going to tell me? Or just serve me with divorce papers out of the blue? He had the grace to look somewhat ashamed. I was trying to find the right time. The right time, I echoed. After 50 years, there is no right time to tell your wife you've been living a double life. Richard sighed, dropping the pretense entirely. What do you want, Eleanor? Money? The house? Name your price and we can end this civilly. End this civilly? I repeated, astonished by his audacity. You think I'm negotiating a business deal? My entire life has been a lie, Richard. Not all of it, he countered, his tone reasonable, as if he were explaining something simple to a child. We had good years. We raised 2 children together. But surely you realize things haven't been right between us for a long time. I stared at him, this stranger wearing my husband's face. The only thing not right was your infidelity and deception. I thought we were partners. I believed every word you said. He shrugged, and in that casual gesture, I saw the truth. He felt entitled to what he'd done. In his mind, he deserved both lives. The respectable public one with me and the passionate secret one with Nancy. I want you out of this house, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. Tonight. Richard laughed dismissively. Don't be ridiculous, Eleanor. Where would I go at this hour? I don't know. Your house in Brookline, perhaps. I suggested coldly. You have 30 minutes to pack some essentials. Anything you leave behind, I'll have shipped to you. His amusement vanished. You can't throw me out of my own home. Watch me, I replied. Leave willingly, or I call our children right now and tell them everything, including how you've been embezzling from the family accounts to support your second family. I'm sure Michael would be particularly interested, given his position at the SEC. It was a bluff. I had no evidence of actual embezzlement, and Michael worked in corporate law, not securities regulation, but Richard's face paled. There was something more he was hiding, something he feared Michael might discover through his connections. You wouldn't, he said, but without conviction. Try me, I challenged. 50 years of lies, Richard. What do I have to lose now? We stared at each other across the living room where we'd built so many memories. In his eyes I saw calculation and finally resignation. Fine, he said tersely. I'll get some things. But this isn't over, Eleanor. We'll need to talk settlement terms. Oh, we certainly will, I agreed. But not tonight. Tonight you leave. As he climbed the stairs to our bedroom, I remained standing, afraid that if I sat down, my resolve might crumble. I heard drawers opening and closing, the sound of his suitcase being pulled from the closet, the bathroom cabinet opening and shutting. All the mundane sounds of packing, underscored by the extraordinary circumstances. When he came back downstairs, suitcase in hand, he paused at the bottom of the staircase. For a moment he looked like the man I'd married, a bit lost, a bit sad. But then his expression hardened again. You're making a mistake, he said. I have friends. Powerful friends. This won't end well for you. I smiled thinly. Goodbye, Richard. I'll have my lawyer contact yours tomorrow. After the door closed behind him, I walked around the house, methodically locking every door and window. Then I poured myself a large glass of the expensive scotch Richard saved for special occasions and sat in the dark living room, surrounded by the scattered rose petals of my ruined anniversary. I didn't cry again. Instead, I started to plan. The next morning, I made 3 phone calls before I even had breakfast. The first was to Janet Kim, a brilliant divorce attorney I'd met through my volunteer work at the women's shelter. The second was to Michael, asking him to come home for an emergency family meeting. No, everyone was healthy, but it was urgent. The third was to our family bank, where I'd maintained a separate account Richard knew nothing about, my mad money, as my mother had called it. Not much, but enough to retain Janet's services. Then I showered, dressed in my most professional outfit, applied makeup to hide the evidence of my sleepless night, and drove to the bank. There I removed everything from our safe deposit box, jewelry Richard had given me over the years, our children's birth certificates, the deed to our house, and other important documents. By noon, I was sitting in Janet's office, laying out what I knew of Richard's deception. "First things first," she said after listening to my story, her expression serious. "We need to freeze all your joint assets immediately. If what you're telling me is true." "It is," I insisted. "Then he's likely already moving money around. Did you bring those financial documents you mentioned?" I handed over the photos I'd taken from Richard's safe. Janet whistled low as she scrolled through them on my phone. "Mrs. Mitchell, your husband has been very busy and very sloppy. These transfers are textbook hidden asset manipulation. And look here." She pointed to a series of numbers on one statement. "These are offshore accounts. Cayman Islands by the look of them." I felt my stomach clench. What does that mean? It means he's been hiding money for years, probably to avoid taxes as well as to keep it from you. Janet's expression was grim. But it also means we have leverage. The IRS takes a very dim view of offshore accounts used for tax evasion. She began typing rapidly on her computer. "I'm drafting emergency motions to freeze all your joint assets and accounts. We'll file them this afternoon. In the meantime, do you have enough money to manage for a few weeks?" I nodded, thinking of my separate account. "Good. Now about the house. Whose name is on the deed?" "Both of ours. It was purchased with money from my inheritance and a mortgage we both signed." Janet nodded, making notes. "And you said your husband has another property in Brookline?" "Yes, purchased for his other family." The word still felt strange on my tongue. "We'll need evidence of that. The documents you photographed are a start, but we'll want property records, proof of payments, anything that shows he used marital assets to fund this other household." For the next 2 hours, Janet outlined our strategy. By the time I left her office, I felt something I hadn't expected. Hope. Not for reconciliation. That ship had sailed the moment Valerie Winters appeared. As I drove home from Janet's office, my phone rang. It was Richard. "Eleanor, we need to talk." His voice was tense but controlled. "I've been trying to reach you all morning." "I've been busy," I replied evenly, keeping my eyes on the road. Filing for divorce tends to take up one's schedule. There was a pause, then a short, humorless laugh. "That was fast. I thought you might want to discuss terms privately before involving lawyers." "Like you discussed your plans to leave me destitute privately?" I countered. "No thank you. From now on we communicate through legal counsel." "This is unnecessary, Eleanor. We could have worked something out that was fair to both." "Fair?" I interrupted, pulling into my driveway. "Was it fair to maintain 2 families for almost 30 years? Was it fair to drain our retirement accounts for your secret life? Was it fair to plan my financial ruin while I was planning our anniversary dinner?" "You're being emotional," he said dismissively. "This is precisely why we need to talk face to face." "I'm coming over." "Don't," I said sharply. "I've changed the locks. If you show up, I'll call the police." Another pause. "Changed the locks? That's my house too, Eleanor. You can't just." "I absolutely can," I cut in. "My lawyer filed an emergency motion this morning. Until the court rules otherwise, I have exclusive use of the marital home. Goodbye, Richard." I hung up before he could respond and sat in my car for a moment, hands trembling slightly but resolve intact. The house before me, the beautiful colonial we'd purchased when Michael was just a baby, suddenly looked different to me. Not a home filled with memories but an asset, perhaps the most valuable one in our marital portfolio. That thought stopped me short. I'd never considered our house as an investment before, just as our home. But now, with my future so uncertain, I began to see everything differently. Inside, I went straight to Richard's study again, this time without any hesitation or guilt. I began a thorough inventory of everything: books, artwork, electronics, the antique desk he'd insisted on buying at that auction in New Hampshire. I photographed it all, then moved through the rest of the house doing the same, creating a detailed record of our marital possessions. When I reached our bedroom, I opened Richard's closet and was surprised to find it still mostly full. He'd taken only a small suitcase last night. His expensive suits, custom shoes, the collection of watches I'd added to every Christmas, all still there. Each item represented thousands of dollars, many purchased with my family's money. On impulse, I counted the watches in his display case. 3 were missing, no doubt the most valuable ones. I made a note to tell Janet. My phone rang again. This time it was Michael. Mom? What's going on? Is Dad okay? Are you? I took a deep breath. We're both physically fine, Michael. But I need you to come home as soon as possible. There are things happening that I need to discuss with you in person. You're scaring me, he said, his voice tight with concern. Just tell me what's wrong. Your father and I are divorcing, I said simply. It's complicated and potentially messy. I'd rather explain everything when you're here. Divorcing? He echoed, sounding stunned. After 50 years? Mom, what happened? I sighed, suddenly feeling every one of my 70 years. It's a long story, and not one I want to tell twice. Have you spoken to Sarah yet? No, I called you first when I got your message. Call her, please. See if you can both come this weekend. I promise I'll explain everything then. After hanging up, I continued my inventory, now with even greater determination. By evening, I had documented every significant item in the house and compiled a list of all our known financial accounts, properties, and investments. It wasn't comprehensive. I was sure Richard had hidden assets I knew nothing about, but it was a start. I ordered takeout for dinner, something I rarely did when Richard was home. He considered it lazy and wasteful. As I ate my pad thai directly from the container while watching a crime drama Richard would have disdained, I felt a strange sensation bubbling up inside me: freedom. For decades, my life had revolved around Richard's preferences, Richard's schedule, Richard's needs. Even as our children grew and left home, even as I developed my own interests and volunteer work, he had remained the sun around which my world orbited. Now that sun had collapsed, revealing itself as nothing more than smoke and mirrors, and I was adrift, terrified, yes, but also inexplicably liberated. The next morning, I met with our family financial advisor, Harold Peterson. Richard and Harold had been golf buddies for years, and I braced myself for resistance when I explained the situation. To my surprise, Harold's normally jovial face turned somber as I spoke. Mrs. Mitchell, he said when I finished, I'm deeply sorry about this situation, but I have to tell you, I've been concerned about some of Richard's financial decisions for quite some time. I leaned forward. What do you mean? Harold looked uncomfortable. There are professional boundaries here, but given the circumstances, Richard has been making increasingly risky investments over the past 5 years. Withdrawing substantial sums from your joint accounts and redirecting them into ventures I advised against. What kinds of ventures? Primarily real estate developments in emerging markets. Some have performed adequately, but several have failed spectacularly. He hesitated. Mrs. Mitchell, I have to ask, did Richard ever mention a development project in Belize to you? My stomach dropped. No, never. Harold nodded as if confirming a suspicion. I'm afraid he invested heavily in a resort development there that has since been revealed as essentially a Ponzi scheme. The principals were arrested last year, and investors lost everything. How much did he lose? I asked, dreading the answer. Nearly $2 million, Harold replied quietly. I felt the blood drain from my face. $2 million gone. Money that should have secured our retirement, possibly paid for our grandchildren's education someday. Why didn't you tell me? I demanded, anger flaring. Harold had the grace to look ashamed. Richard assured me you were fully aware and on board with all investment decisions. As the primary account holder. Primary account holder? I interrupted. These were joint accounts. We should have had equal status. Harold shook his head. On paper, yes. But Richard had designated himself as the primary contact and decision-maker. It's not uncommon in couples of your generation, he added, as if that excused everything. I took a deep breath, tamping down my anger. It wouldn't help me now. Harold, I need complete documentation of all our accounts and investments, going back at least 10 years. Every transaction, every withdrawal, every investment Richard made, whether I was consulted or not. Mrs. Mitchell, that's an enormous amount of paperwork, and some of it may require Richard's permission too. I'm not asking, Harold. I cut in firmly. Either you provide these documents or my next call is to your firm's compliance department, followed by one to the regulatory authorities. I don't think either of us wants that. He blinked, clearly surprised by my assertiveness. I'll have everything prepared by Monday. Tomorrow, I countered. I'll send a courier to collect it. As I drove home, a new realization settled in my mind. Richard hadn't just betrayed me emotionally with his second family. He'd also betrayed me financially, gambling with our future on risky investments while simultaneously funneling money to his other household. The combined effect had likely decimated our marital assets far beyond what I'd initially feared. Back at home, I headed straight for Richard's study again. This time I bypassed the desk entirely and went to the bookshelf, pulling out volumes seemingly at random. Richard wasn't a reader. The leather-bound classics were mostly for show, but he was methodical and paranoid about his records. Behind a row of never-opened Dickens novels, I found what I was looking for: a thin black ledger. Richard was old school in some ways, preferring paper records for his most sensitive information. I'd seen him writing in a notebook like this over the years but had never paid much attention. The ledger contained handwritten notes about various investments, properties, and accounts. Some I recognized, others completely unknown to me. There were notations about the Belize development Harold had mentioned, along with several other projects I'd never heard of. But most importantly, there were account numbers, passwords, and contact information for financial institutions in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Singapore. I photographed every page, then carefully returned the ledger to its hiding place. Richard would never know I'd found it. That evening, Janet called with an update. "The emergency motion was granted," she said, her voice triumphant. "All known joint accounts are frozen, and you have temporary exclusive use of the house. Richard can't remove any property without court approval." "That's good news," I said. "But I've learned there's a lot more to our financial situation than I initially told you." I explained about my meeting with Harold and the ledger I'd discovered. "This changes things," Janet said thoughtfully. "If Richard has been making these risky investments without your knowledge and losing substantial sums, we may be able to argue financial malfeasance. That could significantly impact the division of remaining assets in your favor." "What about the offshore accounts?" I asked. "Those are trickier," she admitted. "Offshore accounts aren't inherently illegal, but given the context, his second family, the planned divorce, the hidden assets, it certainly suggests intent to deprive you of your fair share. We'll need to engage a forensic accountant to trace the money flows." The prospect of more experts, more expenses made my stomach clench. "Janet, I'm worried about money. If our accounts are frozen, how am I supposed to pay for all this?" "The court order specifies that reasonable living expenses and legal fees can be paid from the joint accounts," she assured me. "You won't be left without resources while we sort this out." After hanging up, I sat in the kitchen, nursing a cup of tea and contemplating the surreal turn my life had taken. 1 week ago, I'd been preparing to celebrate 50 years of what I thought was a loving, if imperfect, marriage. Now I was tracking hidden bank accounts and hiring forensic accountants to untangle my husband's financial deceptions. The weekend arrived, bringing with it Michael and Sarah. They arrived separately, Michael flying in from Chicago, Sarah driving up from New York, but converged on the house within hours of each other. I'd prepared myself for their questions, their shock, their inevitable disbelief. What I wasn't prepared for was Michael's expression when I opened the door to him. Not confusion or concern, but grim understanding. "You know," I said softly as he stepped into the foyer, setting down his suitcase. It wasn't a question. He nodded tightly. "Not everything, but enough. I've suspected for years that Dad was hiding something." Before I could ask what he meant, Sarah's car pulled into the driveway. I watched through the window as my daughter, always the more emotional of my children, practically ran to the door, her face tight with worry. "Mom!" she exclaimed, embracing me fiercely. "What's going on? Where's Dad?" Michael was totally cryptic on the phone. I led them both to the living room, where I'd set out coffee and the almond cookies Sarah loved. For a moment I just looked at them. My beautiful children, now adults with lives and challenges of their own. Michael, 47, with his father's height and my determination. A successful corporate attorney with a wife and 2 teenagers. Sarah, 44, creative and compassionate, who'd found her calling as a pediatric occupational therapist after her own son was diagnosed with autism in early childhood. How would this revelation affect them? Would they blame me for not knowing, for being so blind for so long? Would they take their father's side? "Mom," Sarah prompted gently, "you're scaring us." Just tell us what's happening. So I did. I told them everything. Valerie's visit, the evidence she'd provided, the house in Brookline, the hidden financial dealings, the planned divorce that would have left me with almost nothing. I showed them the photographs I'd taken of the documents, the ledger, the offshore account information. Sarah cried quietly as I spoke, occasionally shaking her head in disbelief. Michael's expression grew harder. His jaw clenched so tightly I feared for his teeth. When I finished, there was a long silence, broken only by Sarah's muffled sobs. "I'll kill him," Michael finally said, his voice deceptively calm. "I swear to God I'll kill him." "No, you won't," I replied firmly. "That's not why I told you." "Then why did you?" Sarah asked, wiping her eyes. "What do you need from us, Mom?" I took a deep breath. "First, I need you to know that whatever happens between your father and me, you are not required to take sides. He remains your father, and I would never ask you to sever that relationship." Michael made a disgusted noise. "After what he's done, you're too generous." "Second," I continued, ignoring his outburst, "I need your help understanding some of the financial documents I've found. Michael, with your legal background, you might see things my lawyer has missed. And Sarah, you've always been better with technology than me. I need help securing my computer and phone. I'm worried your father might try to access my devices remotely." They both nodded, eager to have concrete ways to assist. "But mostly," I admitted, "I just needed you to hear the truth from me, before Richard has a chance to spin his version of events." "Has he tried to contact you?" Michael asked. "Several times. I've refused to speak with him except through lawyers." Sarah looked troubled. "Has he tried to contact us?" "My phone's been off since I started driving." As if on cue, Michael's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and his expression darkened. "Speak of the devil. It's Dad." The three of us stared at the vibrating phone on the coffee table. After a moment, Michael reached for it, but I placed my hand on his. "Remember what I said. He's still your father." Michael hesitated, then nodded and answered the call, putting it on speaker. "Hello, Dad," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Michael, thank God." Richard sounded relieved. "I've been trying to reach you. Have you spoken to your mother?" "I'm with her now. Sarah too." There was a pause. "I see. So she's told you her version of events." Michael's eyes met mine, and I could see him struggling to maintain his composure. "She showed us evidence, Dad. Documents, photos, bank statements." Another longer pause. "It's complicated, son. More complicated than you can imagine. Things between your mother and me haven't been right for years." 30 years apparently," Michael replied coldly. "Since around the time you started your second family." "That's not fair," Richard protested. "Your mother and I had problems long before Nancy." I felt Sarah stiffen beside me at the casual mention of the other woman's name. "I don't want to discuss this over the phone," Richard continued. "Can we meet? All of us? I can explain everything." "I don't think that's a good idea right now, Dad," Michael said, glancing at Sarah's tearful face and my tight expression. "We need some time to process this." "Michael, please. I'm still your father. Don't let your mother turn you against me." At that, I saw something snap in my son's eyes. "Mom has said repeatedly that we shouldn't take sides, that you're still our father no matter what. The only one trying to manipulate the situation is you. As usual." "I want to see my dad," a new voice interjected. All three of us turned to see Ethan, Sarah's 17-year-old son, standing in the doorway of the living room. He must have arrived while we were talking, using the key he'd had since he started visiting on his own a few years back. "Ethan," Sarah said, quickly wiping her eyes, "I didn't hear you come in." "Obviously," he replied, his expression a teenage mix of defiance and uncertainty. "What's going on? Why is everyone talking about Grandpa like he's done something terrible?" There was an awkward silence. From the phone, Richard's voice came hesitantly. "Is that Ethan?" "Yes, it's me," Ethan answered, moving closer to the coffee table. "Grandpa, what's happening? Mom's crying and everyone looks upset." "It's just a misunderstanding, buddy," Richard said, his voice softening in a way it only did for his grandchildren. "Adult stuff. Nothing for you to worry about." I watched Ethan's face harden slightly at being so obviously dismissed. At 17, he was no longer a child to be placated with vague reassurances. "If it's making my mom cry, it's my business," he said firmly. "Someone tell me what's going on." Michael, Sarah, and I exchanged glances. How much should a teenager know about his grandfather's double life? Sarah made the decision. "Dad, will call you back later. I need to talk to my son." Without waiting for a response, she ended the call and turned to Ethan. "Sit down, honey. There's something you need to know about Grandpa and Grandma." Over the next hour, Sarah explained the situation to Ethan in age-appropriate but honest terms. To his credit, my grandson listened thoughtfully, asking clarifying questions and occasionally looking to me for confirmation. "So Grandpa has a whole other family?" he finally asked, his brow furrowed. "Like a secret daughter close to Mom's age?" I nodded. "Her name is Valerie. She's about 26 years younger than your mother." Ethan was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then he looked at me with a directness that reminded me of Sarah at the same age. "Are you okay, Grandma? This must be really hard." His simple concern brought tears to my eyes. "I'm managing, sweetheart. Having your mom and uncle here helps. And you too." He nodded seriously. "What are you going to do now? About the house and money and stuff?" "That's what we're trying to figure out," Michael interjected. "Grandma has a good lawyer, and we're going to help her make sure Grandpa doesn't take advantage of her." "Good," Ethan said firmly. "Because it's not fair. Grandma's the nicest person ever, and Grandpa was mean to lie to her for so long." Out of the mouths of babes, I thought, touched by his straightforward sense of justice. The rest of the weekend was a blur of activity. Michael pored over the financial documents I'd collected, making notes and occasionally cursing under his breath. Sarah secured my devices, changing passwords and installing security software she assured me would keep Richard from accessing my digital life. Ethan, eager to help, tackled the practical task of changing the locks on all the doors, a project he completed with surprising efficiency. By Sunday evening I felt more secure, both physically and emotionally, than I had since Valerie's revelation. My children's unwavering support bolstered me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Their practical assistance was valuable, but their belief in me, their righteous anger on my behalf, meant even more. As we sat together for a final dinner before they returned to their lives, Sarah raised her glass of wine. "To Mom, the strongest woman I know." Michael and Ethan raised their glasses too. "To new beginnings," Michael added. "To justice," Ethan contributed solemnly. I smiled at my family, feeling a wave of gratitude despite everything. To family, the real kind. After they left, the house felt emptier but not as desolate as I'd feared. Their visit had transformed the space somehow, replacing memories of Richard with fresh ones of solidarity and love. The next morning, I woke with a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt in decades. Over coffee, I made a list titled Eleanor's New Life, and began filling it with goals, both immediate and long-term. First on the list, financial independence. The divorce would eventually be settled, but I didn't want to wait for that resolution to begin taking control of my economic future. I called Janet. "I want to sell the house," I told her without preamble. "The marital home?" she clarified, sounding surprised. "Eleanor, you don't have to do that. The court granted you exclusive use, and in a divorce after a long-term marriage like yours, you'd likely be awarded the house anyway." "I don't want it," I said firmly. "It's too big for just me, too expensive to maintain, and filled with memories I'd rather leave behind. Besides, this neighborhood has appreciated significantly since we bought the place. The sale could provide capital I desperately need right now." "For what purpose?" Janet asked, practical as always. I hesitated, then decided to trust her with my nascent plan. "I want to invest in real estate. Smaller properties that generate rental income." Richard made risky investments in foreign developments, but I'm thinking local, reliable properties that provide steady returns. There was a pause, then Janet chuckled. "Eleanor Mitchell, you continue to surprise me. I thought you might be calling to cry about your husband's latest antics, but instead, you're planning your financial empire." I smiled despite myself. "Well, I have 50 years of being the supportive wife to make up for. It's time I supported myself for a change." Red on my doorstep, but for justice and perhaps even a future I could control.